Jung, thank you so much for joining us here on the program. You know, the world was swept away by your original book, Wild Swans, 30 years ago. Why have you decided to write this one, updated in the way that you have in this moment?
For many years, I resisted writing a sequel to Wild Swans. But then in 2023, my mother was very ill. She was in her early 90s, and she was clearly dying. And I was unable to go back and visit her at her deathbed. So I felt very sad, and I looked at her from my iPhone, from my mobile. And I just felt how much I owe this extraordinary woman who is my mother, my freedom, my career as a writer, and my life and happiness. And so I then decided to write a sequel to Wild Swans. I also felt the time was right, because when Wild Swans ends in 1978, when I left China and when China began reforms. And now, more than 30 years later, China was going backward to the bad old days. So I feel that it's an end of an era. I would like to record that era as well as the stories of my family.
Yes, because the original book was honouring your grandmother, your mother, and also looking at your own life and what they lived through. So just talk us through this moment as well, because you just said that you couldn't go to your mother's deathbed, you couldn't go to China. Help our audience understand why.
Well, because the books I have written, including Wild Swans and the biographies of Mao, Empress Dowager Cixi, and other major figures of China, the books I've written, they are all banned in China. And in 2018, President Xi made it a crime punishable by imprisonment and worse if you were deemed to have insulted revolutionary heroes. And Mao was the #1 revolutionary hero in China. His portrait is on Tiananmen Gate. His corpse is in the center of Beijing, and his face is on every Chinese banknote. So I then feared that my problem now was not to fight to go back to China and see my mother, but to be let in and may not be let out. Prison or even worse. And so I made the very painful decision of not to fight to go back and see my mother.
Which would have been incredibly painful and difficult.
It is, because my mother, we had a very strong relationship, and that relationship was forged in the Cultural Revolution, starting when I was 14. And I described our stories, my mother's story. My mother was, refused to betray my father, refused to denounce my father. She was made to kneel on broken glass in those denunciation meetings where, the victims had their arms ferociously twisted to the back and their heads were pushed down. And my mother was kicked and beaten, made to kneel on broken glass. And on one occasion, I actually went with my mother because she was having hemorrhage. My grandma was very worried that my mother might not survive the ghastly denunciation rally. And so I waited and experienced this horrendous scene of thousands of people thrusting their arms up and calling for her blood and her suffering. And so my mother, made it possible for me to come to Britain in the first place. Of course, I mean, I haven't got time to go into the detail now, but she gave me the freedom. And once I was in Britain, and she inspired me to write Wild Swans. And so I felt, you know, I just wanted to write a book and to tell the story of mainly our lives after 1979, how we had come from this period of hope and China opening its doors, making friends with the West, and, you know, walking even towards democracy, you know, at one point we hoped, to today when it was determined to go to worship Mao, to go back to the Maoist days, and to be not friends with the West.
Why do you think China, I mean, we know that the rise of Xi Jinping, his desire to be emperor or president for life, trying to emulate Mao in many ways, even describing him, you almost called him Chairman Xi
Yes,
in one moment, because, you know, in your mind, you're equating him to Mao in many ways.
Well, because he calls himself the heir of Mao, the real successor of Mao, and he is. And Mao had this ambition to dominate the world as soon as he took China in 1949. And that dream had basically underlay all China's disasters, including the Great Famine, in which 40 million people died of starvation. And Mao was exporting food to the Soviet bloc to buy technology and equipment to turn China into a military superpower so he could dominate the world. And Xi had inherited that dream. And of course, except now China is rich, he doesn't have to export food. But he was taking over what Mao had started. But of course, that's the sort of biography I wrote after Wild Swans. And this book is not so much about all those political events, but about my mother's life, my life, and our memories of my grandma who died in the Cultural Revolution.
And you do chronic you coming to Britain in this new book, your mother visiting you, what your life was like, how you perceived Britain, where you saw yourself within that. And I guess in many ways, where you've ended up seeing yourself and your family and, you know, the country that you love, but you cannot visit.
Well, yes. I came to Britain in 1978 when China had just begun to open its doors. I had come from a world that was completely isolated from the outside world. And, you know, I never saw a foreigner except some foreign sailors were at the port in South China, where my fellow students and I were sent to practice our English with these foreign sailors. And of course, we were so keen to talk to them. We grabbed them as soon as they came on shore, and we had no idea what must be on their mind. And so when we came to Britain in a group of 14 people, and London was like another planet, and everything was new. We were under orders not to go out on our own. We had to move in a group, and we were all wearing the Mao suit, and we were quite a sight in the London streets. My English was learned under Mao, and our teachers had never seen foreigners themselves. So our textbooks were direct translations of Chinese texts, and the lesson greetings was a direct translation. And the Chinese greeted each other with 吃饭了吗？上哪儿去？ which means, where are you going? Have you eaten? And those were the English greetings I learned. So when I first came to London, I walked around and asked people where they were going, whether they had eaten. But I had such incredible fun I mean, the first couple of years, particularly, I mean, exploring this Mars-like place. And I was the first to do many things. I had to break many rules and do many things the first. And the one thing was to go out on our own. And one particular thing was to go into a pub, because the Chinese translation for pub is 酒吧, which in those years suggested somewhere indecent with nude women gyrating. And I, of course, was torn with curiosity. So one day I walked into a pub and I saw nothing of the kind, only some old man sitting there drinking beer, and I was rather disappointed.
And, you know, has your mum looked at your work and, you know, you say she inspired you to write. She was very much the reason why you became the writer that you are and you have the freedom that you have. Does she look at you and think, I'm very proud of where you are, despite you not being able to return to China, and you face all of these issues if you do go back?
Yes, I think my mother must be. I say must be. Well, the thing is, she is not someone who praises a lot, nor did she criticize. I mean, she just let her children, let myself do our own things. But she was always there for me. And also she inspired me in subtle ways. And for example, she came to stay with me in London in 1988, 10 years after I came to Britain. And she subtly sort of mentioned it would be good if I would write the stories of my family, my grandma particularly. And in those days, I just wanted to forget about China. I wanted to live my life in Britain, enjoy it. And so I didn't show any interest. And my mother never sort of explicitly suggest. But one day we were having a stroll in Hyde Park, and my mother suddenly saw a stone on the ground in the Italian garden. And so she suddenly said, look at that stone. It's just like the millstone which people used to use to crush baby girls' feet to produce the 3-inch golden lilies. 3-inch golden lilies was the name for crippled, bound feet, which my grandma suffered from when she was 2 years old. I mean, basically, you know, two toes, with bones were broken, and only the big toes were normal. I saw my grandmother's feet. I knew horrible they look, but I didn't know how exactly it happened. And so when I heard my mother in Hyde Park, I was very surprised. And, you know, I asked my mother to tell me more, and she told me more. She told me the excruciating, graphic, you know, terrible detail. And then she stayed with me for 6 months, and she talked every day about all the things in my family, which I didn't know. And by the time she left London, she left me 60 hours of tape recording. Wow. And so that's how I wrote Wild Swans. And in this new book, I just wrote about how I came to write Wild Swans, as well as other things.
Extraordinary story. Jung, thank you so much. It's an honor to have you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.